Is this on? Closer. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Hello. Welcome to the 2019 Cogan Alumni Fellowship. We are so happy to have you here. We're also live streaming, so welcome to anyone who is viewing this from afar. I want to thank the many people who made this possible, especially, first and foremost, thanks to Dr. Lockhart-Gilroy for coming, sharing your time and your work with us. We really appreciate it, and we're so pleased you're here. Thank you to the offices of the president and the dean, Marcom, the many offices at Dickinson that support this event every year. A huge thank you to our departmental coordinator, Kelly Winters-Fazio, without whom this would not be possible, without whom many things would not be possible, but a large thank you to her, and when you see her, make sure you thank her, of course. And finally, thanks to all the members of the English Majors Committee who really, through their hard work, their discernment, their thoughtfulness, their efforts, made this happen. So thank you to all those students. And when you see a student member of the EMC, say thank you to them as well. I want to say a few things about the Cogan Fellowship, why I personally value it, and then we'll turn it over to David, who will introduce our speaker. So a few things about the Cogan. First, the Cogan is about community. It's a community that extends in space and time and past and present. The Cogan is a moment we all come together, current students and alums and teachers and administrators and friends and colleagues from across the campus and beyond. And second, the Cogan's really about students. It's about honoring the things that Dickinson students are doing in the world, and it's about our current students choosing the examples and inspirations from whom they want to learn. And third, perhaps most important, the Cogan is about lifelong learning. The namesake of this event, Eleanor Cogan, is certainly an example of that. But the Cogan recognizes that our commitment to education, all of our commitments to education, are not about 4 years or 4 walls, more about how the things we study can change the world and are changed by the world, and how that process is continual and renewed by people we learn from, people we teach, everything that presents us with new questions and new solutions and new challenges. So thanks for being a part of that. Thanks for helping us stay true to that idea. After the question and answer period, of course, this evening there is a reception in the hub to which you're all invited. Between our talk here and the reception, there's a brief pause so everyone can fetch their literary desserts. But if you don't have a literary dessert, please do come to the reception, because we need folks to eat literary desserts as well as to make them. Yes, look forward to more conversation. Thank you so much. And now here's David.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us at the 2019 Cogan Alumni Fellowship Lecture. My name is David Blosser, and I am a senior English major here at Dickinson, and I am honored and excited to serve as the student liaison for this year's Cogan, as it has truly been one of my favorite events at Dickinson, and especially at the English department. For some context, this annual event is in honor of Eleanor Cogan, who passed away in December 2011 at the age of 102. Eleanor took 52 courses at Dickinson, 32 of which were specifically in the English department. So tonight, we honor Eleanor's legacy with a talk by our 2019 Cogan Fellow, Reverend Dr. Annie Lockhart-Gilroy, and with continued conversations on the value of the English major here at Dickinson. In the past year, I have had conversations with fellow English majors about internships, work opportunities, and research, and I'm always amazed by the stories that I hear. From working in the fields of media and technology, arts and culture, sports media, publishing, education, government, nonprofit, the list is endless. And I say this not to rattle off a list of industries, but because I'm continuously inspired by the passions and motivations of my peers in this department. At the same time, I think these diverse experiences speak to the versatility of the English major and the endless opportunities that it opens for all students here in the department. So tonight, we celebrate the English major and our department, beginning with thanking those who help us grow as cogent writers, as critical thinkers, and effective communicators. I want us to thank our professors. So if possible, could the faculty in the room please stand? How else could we learn about the nuances and complexities of close reading, right? It's so important, vital. Thank you, Professor Menon. I especially want to extend my gratitude to Professor Sider-Jost, Professor Scalick, and to our department coordinator, Kelly Winters-Fazio, who planned and coordinated tonight's event. As Professor Phillips said, it would not have been possible without them, so thank you very much. And above all, I want to thank our speaker, Reverend Dr. Annie Lockhart-Gilroy, who traveled here from Oklahoma to serve as the 2019 Cogan Fellow. Can we please give her a round of applause? This year, the English Majors Committee wanted to honor an alum who captured the versatility of the English major and the many ways it can benefit any career. Reverend Dr. Lockhart-Gilroy immediately captured our attention with her work in ministry and womanist theology. So impressive. Lockhart-Gilroy currently teaches at Phillips Theological Seminary in Oklahoma, where she works with students from middle school through the doctoral level. She earned her Ph.D. in Christian education and congregational studies from Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary and her master's in divinity from Princeton. Her teaching and research interests include womanist approaches to working with Black girls, emancipatory pedagogy, faith and developmental theories, and ministry to, with, and for youth and young adults. She's truly a testament to the strength of the English major here at Dickinson and to the department. So without further ado, let us please welcome the 2019 Cogan Fellow, Reverend Dr. Annie Lockhart-Gilroy.
Oh my. Thank you for that introduction. I feel like I need to have you on as my hype man or something. Good afternoon, everybody. It is such a pleasure to be here, and I must admit it's a little surreal. More years ago than I would like to count, I feel like I was the student doing the pickups and putting up the signs and introducing the speakers, and now to see my face on a poster is just kind of weird. But it is great to be here and to share a little bit with you what it is that I do. One theme that runs through my teaching, writing, and identity as an ordained clergy person is the importance of one's story. As a Christian educator, I often teach and use the method of story theology, where one story is told and then reflected upon theologically, to remind people that they are indeed a part of God's continuing story. As a scholar of practical theology with a focus on adolescent spirituality, I often use various methods of ethnography to hear the voices and stories of young people. Practical theology begins with the lived lives of individuals, their stories. Their stories are then reflected upon through an interdisciplinary lens of theology, sociology, educational theory, and developmental psychology. As a womanist scholar, I stand with Black women and girls who have been told that their stories aren't worth telling or listening to. I join other womanist scholars who call that way of thinking out for the lie that it is. We recognize the importance of sharing stories that have been silenced, raise a mic to those voices, and not only share, but center those stories. While human beings, of course, are not simply the sum of our stories do shape us and give us a glimpse of how we got to be who we are. So I welcomed the opportunity to come here and share with you a little bit of my story. In recalling my stories, I see the planting and nurturing of my vocational identity all throughout my life. And it's been particularly interesting dusting off the memories of my time here at Dickinson while trying desperately not to do the math of thinking about how long ago exactly was. Now, if you would have asked me when I was a student here if I thought that I would be a professor of Christian education and practical theology in a seminary, I would have said, is that a thing? I mean, I knew what a seminary was. I knew what Christian education was, but I had no idea that they actually paid people to teach other people how to do that. And the term practical theology would have sounded like such an oxymoron to me that I would have thought that you were just making things up. However, as I think back on my story and some of the shaping that happened on this campus, my wandering journey makes a little bit of sense. So this evening, I share aspects of my story as it pertains to my vocational identity that I see as threefold. Earlier, just a little while ago, we had conversations of what to call me. Are you Reverend Lockhart-Gilroy, Dr. Lockhart-Gilroy, Professor Lockhart-Gilroy? To which I say, yeah. I am an ordained clergy person. I am a scholar. I am an educator. Now, when I walked down the steps of Old West with degree in hand, I was headed to be one of those things, an educator. My goal was to be a high school English teacher because I believed the lies that said, what else are you going to do with an English degree? We're all friends. We can tell each other the truth. I was prepared by my English degree and education certificate. I got the certificate to ease my mother's concerns that I would be a homeless writer. But I eventually grew, I see some people understanding that there. I eventually grew to embrace the idea. During my last semester, I taught at Wilson Middle School as a student teacher. Through that experience, two things were confirmed. First, I did indeed want to give this teaching thing a try. Second, I did not want to teach middle school. I embarked on a 5-year stint as teaching English at the high school level. It was fine. It was hard. I tell people that, it takes at least 5 years to get good at teaching. It takes 2 years to not suck. But, it was fine, but it wasn't it, right? I enjoyed the classroom. I enjoyed working with the students on most days. I didn't love the material, and I'm almost afraid to say it in this room, but I grew tired of covering literature. And at least I thought I did. I was really tired with the way I was being asked to deal with literature. I felt stuck in an educational structure that I thought was taking out all of the joy of curling up with a good book by making it about charting and multiple choice quizzes and exams. And I taught in an independent school where they were more free to explore different ways of assessment. But it still didn't fit me. I was also tired of the narrow literary canon that mostly consisted of dead white men. And when I tried to widen the canon, there was major pushback. I was told that students have to cover these books or they won't be truly educated human beings. I kid you not, that's a direct quote. And when it was suggested that the same text didn't have to be taught every year, I mainly suggested that if we must teach Shakespeare every year, maybe not the same 4. Folks clutched their pearls, graduated from high school without reading Romeo and Juliet, the horror. And that was just me suggesting other Shakespeare plays. So imagine the pushback I got when I said, maybe we don't have to do Mark Twain this year, do James Baldwin instead, coming-of-age story from a different viewpoint. The horror. While some of my colleagues would agree that they did need to diversify the canon, they didn't want to get rid of anything. And the school year wasn't getting any longer, so works written by women and authors of color were placed in elective courses. Staying true to a particular canon in required courses while presenting particular voices in elective courses is to actively marginalize voices. I wanted no part of that. I could have, as certain colleagues of mine did, stay and argue and continuously work to change those things that I thought were limiting. But the curriculum was not the only thing I found restrictive. I found the high school curriculum structure restrictive. I got restless. This restlessness was compounded by the fact that I was professionally living in 2 different worlds. From Monday to Friday, I taught at a prestigious private high school in Princeton, New Jersey. On Friday and Saturday, I traveled 9 miles down the road to Trenton, New Jersey, a small city with mixed socioeconomic realities and a large population of poor and working class people. I worked with youth that had been adjudicated by the court, and on Sundays, I was ministering to youth in that city. And that work was calling me louder and louder. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, but I knew that I wanted to be trained to minister to the mental and spiritual needs of young people. So I took a break, or at least I thought I was taking a break, from the educator part of my vocational identity and embraced the minister side. I entered seminary. Now, to anyone who knew me in college, this would make little sense. While here, I went to church on occasion and cursed like a sailor. Not the makings of a minister, except that it is, but that's another talk. I have the familiar story of one who was raised in the church and took a bit of a sabbatical throughout her college years and returned shortly after. The importance of church was instilled in me as a young girl growing up in a charismatic Catholic church called St. Anne's. Because the church stood on a high hill, we often simply called it the hill. The church on the hill instilled in me 2 foci. 1, my focus on youth ministry, and 2, my focus on social justice, not as secondary, but primary to the gospel. Most of my current speaking engagements and published writing, including my upcoming book that you will all buy and read, is about ministry to, with, and for young people. Watching my older brothers in youth groups skating, hiking, and doing other amazing things looked to my 10-year-old eyes like the greatest thing in the world, and I, as a child, could not wait until I was old enough to join youth group. And when I was finally old enough, I thought I had arrived. And youth group did actually live up to its hype. On the hill, I found a place where I could challenge and be challenged, a place where it was cool to praise God and hang out with people that praise God. I found out that I didn't really like skating or hiking, but I loved being with the people of God. On the hill, I found a community that helped me find my voice. In the mix of sometimes heated discussions, I challenged, questioned, and I was even sometimes told that I was wrong, but I was never told to be silent. On the hill, the theologian within me was nurtured before I knew what a theologian was. From that experience, I learned when done right, youth ministry can shape young people in positive and profound ways. When done right, youth are also encouraged to challenge the church and change the world. My youthful desire for justice was nurtured in part by the example set by 3 Franciscan nuns, Sister Pat, Sister Germaine, and Sister Mary. They were the coolest women I knew. They often work with what society had deemed the least of these, but they treated everyone with the same dignity, recognizing in everyone the image of God. From these sisters, I learned that faith is lived out and that it is our responsibility to participate in the reign of God by working for what is just and right. The passionate fire for social justice was further fanned my senior year when I found myself with a social science requirement to fulfill. I don't know how you do registration these days, but it was a big room. We went from table to table. I'm assuming it's a little different. Right? I wandered around the registration hall looking as sad as I could, looking for a professor that would take a senior into their intro class. Professors didn't like taking seniors into their intro classes because they wanted to leave space for people that might take the class and therefore major in that field, and because they thought that seniors didn't work hard at intro courses. I wanted an intro class because I just wanted to fulfill a requirement and didn't want to work that hard. Someone finally took me in, and I ended up in Lana Momsheimer's Intro to American Studies. Thank God for liberal arts requirements. That class set my soul on fire. I still revisit one of the textbooks of that class from time to time. It's called the 60s paper. Professor Momsheimer centered the study of American culture in the protest movements of the 60s, and that blew my mind. The 60s paper is a collection of essays, letters, articles from people demanding justice for people for whom it had been denied so long. This was my jam. I didn't even have to try to work hard. I love this class so much. I had known that this kind of protest energy was rooted in the American fabric, but to have it centered, to have it be the lens that everything else was seen through, thank God for liberal arts requirements. When I think about that class, what remains with me 20 years later is that it's all about freedom. Freedom is a right. I will fight for others' freedoms and not be afraid to claim my own. Those were the voices of those 60s papers. The class nurtured the rebellious spirit within me and armed it with theory and history. And that rebellious spirit still remains part of my ministerial identity. I view the task of religious education as a minister of the gospel as one that aids people to acquire tools that will help them see their divine potential. If done poorly, a religious education experience could be yet another place where people learn to force themselves into a mold that they were not made to fit. But when done well, religious education frees people to be their authentic, unique, God-designed selves and live lives that they never thought they could. To live lives as freed people. It was in seminary that I learned that vocational identity as a minister and my vocational identity as an educator could go hand in hand. When I discovered the field of religious education, or Christian education, which I often use interchangeably. I also learned about the possibility of a third identity, that of scholar. could be a scholar of religious education. And that sounded so odd to me. I used to think of a scholar like as an adjective, a smart person, and someone who thought a little too highly of themselves, right? Like, I am a scholar. It just sounded like just a not humble thing to say, right? So it was an adjective for me, not a noun, and I didn't understand the verb that would go with it, right? Ministers minister to the people. Educators educate people. And scholars do what exactly? And when I was a student, I thought my professors' jobs comprised of teaching me, preparing to teach me, and grading my work to see how well they taught me. So when one of my mentors said I should consider a Ph.D. in Christian education, I thought, to do what? I just left teaching, and you want me to get another degree so I can teach. Well, scholars do teach, but a large part of what I do is research and write. And that I can do. I was, after all, an English major. I loved writing. At one point, I thought I would be a novelist. In my fiction writing class here, I learned, quite frankly, I wasn't very good. Now, the professor didn't really say that. She didn't have to. It was a workshop class, right? So, the classes where you write things, and then you send it out to all these people, and then they critique it, and you critique theirs. And while it is easy to look at your peers' critique and ignore it because they don't know what they're talking about, it is a little harder to ignore the great work of your peers that you read. It is also harder to ignore when the comment, the critique that comes back always says the same thing. This sounds like an essay to me, more so than a novel or a work of fiction. This sounds like an essay to me, more so than a novel or work of again and again and again. So now I write essays. Especially after I read the 60s paper, which is a bunch of essays that turn the world upside down. So yeah, I'm an essayist. I am now a writer of blogs and think pieces, and within a few months I can say that I am a published author of a book. As a scholar, I call myself a womanist practical theologian. I discovered womanist thought in Spar Library. I was taking an Intro to Women's Studies course, but the course was incomplete. None of the major works centered voices were Black women. They may have been an article here or there, but it was clear that these voices were not a part of the established canon, even though so much of the work I was reading was about feminists decrying a limited canon while building a limiting canon. I had a friend tell me that Black women didn't write about gender issues. They wrote about race issues. And I was like, well, I don't see any other syllabus, so this must be true. I recited this to Dr. Pamela Blake, who was the director of multicultural affairs at the time, and she said, yeah, that's nonsense. So I went to the library to see what I could find. And there, in Spar Library, I read Alice Walker's In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, womanist prose. And I learned about a term called womanist. And there was a thing called womanism. And yes, I was not the only one having these thoughts. I was not alone in my desire to talk about the intersection of race and gender. I was not the only one that thinks that it is inane to answer questions like, do you see yourself more as a woman or a Black person? And yes, I got those questions all the time. Somebody, I thought, gets me. As my final project for that course, I developed a syllabus. The professor said that she could not teach these other voices because she did not know them. I thought I'd try to take that excuse away. I created my first Intro to Womanist Studies syllabus. I thought that it was not enough to expand the canon and develop a syllabus that included the voices of Black women. Instead, I centered the voices of Black women. Then later on in seminary, I was introduced to womanist theology. In short, womanist theology centers the lives of Black women and invites theological reflection. Where is God in the lives of these women? How is God at work? What does it mean for Black women to be women of faith within ecclesiastical constructs and structures steeped in white supremacy and patriarchy? These are big questions, and there are no shortage of attempts of answers for these. Yet in my career, I try to offer a few more. Womanist theology uses Alice Walker's definition of womanism. Yet another way, I see the roots of my Dickinson experience being watered. As I sat in Spar Library reading Walker's work, she introduced me to someone else, Zora Neale Hurston. Her discussion of Hurston's work made me think of Hurston as someone that I needed to know. So I read Their Eyes Were Watching God and other works of Hurston. Changed my life. Hurston's use of Black vernacular alongside with what is called standard written English spoke volumes to me. The idea that these different takes on the same language could be placed side by side and be equally poetic and equally beautiful moved me so much that I wrote my senior thesis on it. What also moved me once again was the centering of the Black community. Hurston's stories were not about Black culture in juxtaposition to other cultures. She had novels and short stories with only Black people in it. It was just about Black culture. Again, the centering. The centering of Black people was so desperately what I needed in this space, because I was discovering all of these things in this space where I was told to be lucky if I was but only a footnote. Let me explain. A little background and a little real talk. I hail from St. Croix, Virgin Islands, also known as America's Paradise. I joyfully refer to my home as America's Paradise because it is a beautiful place and a great place to grow up and call home. I mournfully refer to my home as America's Paradise because it truthfully connotes ownership. It is a colony of the United States, though more often referred to as a territory. Virgin Islanders are full citizens of the United States and receive the benefits of that citizenship, but not the full benefits. We are denied the benefit of certain federal programs. We are denied the right to vote for president. We are denied full representation in Congress. It is probably no surprise that I would center my work around methodologies that amplify voices, since I come from a people that have neither an electoral one or the power that comes along with it. But that has not stopped Virgin Islanders from finding various ways to claim their power and make sure that they are seen and heard. It is a legacy that I proudly claim. My identity was formed in a context of people demanding to be seen and heard. Calling my shift from St. Croix, Virgin Islands to Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, a culture shock is a little bit of an understatement. Because I lived in an island over 2,000 miles away, there was no road trip to visit colleges, and college websites were not a thing yet, so I relied on the college brochure. When I saw a Black person in every picture, I didn't realize that was all the Black people on campus. My class had 10 Black students in it, and it was so much bigger than they had seen in a while. The Black students on campus threw a party because there were now over 30 Black students. For the first time in my life, I was an ethnic minority. And while I knew the numbers of Black students were small, I really had no concept of what that meant. And I was not ready. I wasn't ready for my roommate to gleefully tell me that she had discussed my Blackness with the rest of the floor and had good news. It was okay that I was Black. I wasn't ready for the fact that this was her trying to be a good friend and not understanding why I was not okay with the fact that people were debating my humanity. I wasn't ready for scholars to be okay with the fact that they could not include Black women in their syllabus because they didn't know their work and really didn't see a reason to go to the same library that I went to. I wasn't ready. After my first semester, what I was ready to do was transfer. I stayed because Dickinson was one of the few places with study abroad programs in West Africa. I wanted to go to Cameroon, and it was worth it. Even more than that, I stayed because my identity was formed in the context of people demanding to be seen and heard. So I was going to be seen and heard, not as a footnote or as someone in the margins, but I was going to plop myself down and have a seat right smack dab in the center. When classes were not offered that spoke to me, I did independent studies. When I thought that voices were ignored, I centered them. And while I am still annoyed that I had to do that, that training is the foundation of my vocational identity. In my teaching, my preaching, my writing, I aim to center voices that have been marginalized. And I encourage my students to claim their voice and share the mic. The purpose of claiming one's voice is not to drown out another, but to recognize that we all fare better when voices are recognized, when many voices are recognized. And on the first day of every semester, I encourage my students to do what I did. As much as I try to include a variety of voices, a syllabus can handle so much. A semester is only so long. And no student has ever thought, we really need more reading in this class. So I encourage my students to claim their education. And I tell them, you are the one sacrificing your time, your money, your energy. Make sure that this education works for you. Demand it. There is an assignment that you really want to do instead of the final, make a case for it. Not always gonna say yes, you're gonna make a case for it. There is an area of study within this class you want to dig around, make a case for it. Let's talk. I'm not confined to a canon. In fact, I'd rather blow it all up. So let's talk. That's my invitation to them, and that's my invitation to you. So let's talk. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that really powerful presentation. And in keeping with that amazing invitation, we do have a lot of time for questions here. So let's begin the conversation. And please say your name when you ask your question, please.
Hi.
Hi.
Is it working? Oh, okay. I'm Emily, and thank you so much that was an amazing talk. I was just wondering, how often have you actually had a student come to you and make a case for a different assignment or expanding the canon of what you're teaching in your classes, or the lack of a canon, rather?
Oh.
Different.
I should try.
Oh, there we go. Okay, I'm thinking of the streaming people that they need mics. So it's often an issue of context. So I teach mostly master's students at this point and doctoral students, right? So there's a little bit more of an idea of what they want in the education that they go for. And I find that the more upper levels you go to, the easier this is to do. But many of my students who are taking these ministry classes are already in ministry, and it becomes an issue of context, right? So I want to do things to learn about the people that I am serving right now. But you know, I welcome the conversations, and sometimes the conversations don't always go to another assignment, but it does go down a different path for that student.
Hi, my name is Titi. So the question I have for you, Reverend Annie, is do you have students who often come to you with questions about the relationship between Christianity in general and minority groups or just people of color all over the world? And if they are wrestling with, okay, this is a religion that was kind of forced upon some people, but now people have found ways to take ownership of the religion because they've done their research, but also still questioning where is God in indigenous ways of worship? I hope my question is kind of clear.
It does make sense. Thank you, TT. That's a hard one. And yes, the answer to your question is I have students that bring that up all the time. I just had that conversation this weekend in one of my weekend classes. Because it's a difficult one, and I mentioned one of the questions of womanist theology is how are Black women of faith when they're serving institutions that's steeped, right, in patriarchy and white supremacy? And to say, we just don't do that, right? Like that's too simple and it doesn't really work that way. But I do find that it is indeed a struggle for many students. I hear that it happens the most in church history classes. I don't teach those classes, but I have been through those classes and I could definitely understand that. Because students come to me with a love for the church and they want to serve the church. And then they understand what that infrastructure church has meant and done and been a part of and orchestrated. And then it's how do I reconcile that? And what I say is it is part of the ongoing struggle. I obviously have chosen to stay. I am continuously reconciling that, if that answers your question.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to see a practical theologian and working in the areas that you are, a womanist. I'm actually the chair of the religion department, so and I've been here a long time. I don't remember you, but did you take?
I didn't take religion classes.
No. That was my question. Did you take any religion courses while you were at Dickinson?
I took one. Bible and contemporary issues.
Yes, with Dan Bechtel, Professor Dan Bechtel. Yes,
Okay.
it was a free-for-all. Yeah. No, it was one of the most. It was one of the most popular and important courses, but also it just often just got really heated.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, so that was the only one you took. Because some of what your story talks about is similar to my story. I went to colleges and I was an English major and a religion major, and then went on. I decided to skip seminary. I just decided to write and teach here. But the womanist theology and the power of those stories and storytelling is a very important addition to seminary education and undergraduate education. You also talked about, and when you were here, you got certified in education. I also chaired the education program for a while. But you talked about educational psychology. How do you fold that in to your work? So which educational psychologist are you thinking about?
Okay. All right, just backtrack. So one, I took that one religion course, liberal arts requirement. I had many years of Catholic school before I got here, and I was just kind of done. Did not think that being a scholar of religion was going to be a thing that I was going to do. So little did I know. The educational psychology, so I use folks like Erickson and Piaget, and I actually spent a lot of time speaking against folks like Erickson and Piaget. But that helps me for a couple of reasons. One, thinking about how young people learn, right? Looking at the development of young people, what works with the context and population of people that I have worked with and what doesn't ring true, right? So both using those theories and speaking against those theories. So you may have gathered that what I do is very interdisciplinary, right? And I'm pulling from a bunch of different disciplines. Another good reason for liberal arts education, because I've had a lot of those backgrounds here. So the education certificate gave me the introduction to educational psychology and the idea that people learn differently, and developmental psychology, and just understanding education and pedagogy in and of itself, right? The basic question, what is education for in the first place, right? Like what's the purpose of it? And all of that is roped in to what I teach.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Elaine. So this is kind of going back to TT's question, thinking about how there have been a lot of crimes and violence done in the name of religion. The one I'm thinking of is currently the Buddhist nationalist movement to commit genocide against the Rohingya Muslim people. So thinking of a way to speak to young folks just about the history of ongoing violence on part of religion. How are those conversations like ideally shaped? How can those conversations be brought up to a youth group?
So I find that those young people are asking these questions, right? In this generation, we have this growing, which kind of started with Gen X, and this growing understanding of people that are turning away from organized religion, but not turning away from spirituality, right? Not turning away from the transcendent or the divine or the understanding that there's something bigger out there, but having some serious grievances with organized religion. And in these conversations, what I have done is talked about why I haven't abandoned organized religion, right? I think of the saying of Gandhi is, I like your Christ, but I don't like your Christians, right? And my push is to make Christianity look more and more like my Christ, right? Recognizing that it always hasn't. But that's my push, and that's why I'm still here, and hopefully while they will remain. I don't lament the fall of mainline Christianity like many of my peers do, simply because to say that the church that it exists is getting less powerful, quite frankly, I'm not convinced that's a bad thing, right? Because when that happens, I think that can help us make Christianity look more like Christ, right? You can't be empire and countercultural at the same time. You just can't, right? I'd rather not be empire.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk and for being here and for sharing your experiences with us. My name is Sheila Jane Menon. I'm a faculty member in the English department. There may be ways in which you've started to touch on this already, but I was wondering with the different youth populations that you work with, and in the time that you've been working with them, has there been a noticeable shift for you in sort of the central challenge in the kind of ministerial and teaching work that you do with youth at any age range, right? But in the time that you've been doing this work and across those age groups, has there been a particularly momentous shift that you've noticed that has been challenging or maybe invigorating to the work that you do?
Right. So as I'm thinking, my first answer is no. My second answer is I wish, because I feel like so often what I do is saying, you know, you're worthy, you have a voice worth listening to. You're worthy, you have a voice worth listening to. I want to live in a world where I don't have to say that anymore, right? Like I just want to be like, you get it, now let's move on to something else. But I often find, I mean, there's different things that's presented in the way that the world is changing, right? But I still find that the ultimate questions and concerns remain the same.
Hi, my name is Victoria, and I'm a freshman here, so I'm just starting my journey of like being a potential English major and expanding what I'm reading. And you listed a couple of the different people who have influenced you and your idea of like expanding beyond the canon you were already given. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and maybe talk about a couple of the other people who have influenced you.
Sure. Thanks for the question. So, oddly enough, a lot of the people that I ended up finding were folks just because I was browsing, right? A bookstore, and it's like, oh, so you want to read this book? Next to that book is another one that's kind of like it, right? Which is the same as Amazon recommends. Those who bought this book may like this book. So other folks that have, I'm trying to think of other texts that have influenced me. Y. Sargasso C. I took in a Caribbean lit class, and the Wine of Astonishment. Taking those classes that was written in a dialect that I grew up hearing had a similar effect for me that Hurston did, right? Because while I grew up hearing this dialect, this is not dialect that you wrote down or dialect you used in professional spaces, right? So to see it being written down and being beautiful and bringing forth metaphor was extremely powerful. My favorite text is Their Eyes Were Watching God, and other essays by Hurston. A collection of Hurston's work, which I love the title, I Love Myself When I'm Smiling, and Then Again When I'm Looking Mean and Impressive. That's just a really good title with a collection of works in it. So those would be at the top of my list. And one of my favorite books to teach was actually Huck Finn. So even though I was just like, just 1 year without it would be fine.
Sorry, there's a question.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Chang, and I actually have been like refraining myself from like not asking this question, but I cannot stop thinking about it while I was listening to you talking. So recently on the Dickinsonian, there's an article is basically like talking about like how like my minor groups, and their voice is sometimes not often heard, and it has been causing a lot of like heat around the campus. So how do you think like one group can like have their voice be heard, and while not like sort of like using maybe the tone or the language that might offend another group? Because I think that has been the conversation that has been like the topic around the campus recently, and I don't think there's a good reconciliation to that question. Thank you.
So not to speak to a particular issue that I don't know much about, even though I heard a little about it at lunch. Your tone question is a difficult one because I don't know if there is a tone that helps people hear you need to get out the center, right? Or even you need to share the center. What people hear is I get less, and nobody wants less, right? So I don't know how you make people hear that, right? So quite frankly, I don't worry too much about tone. Because as far as I'm concerned, you know, you still get pie. So if we're all eating pie, you don't get 3/4 of the pie, you get 1/4 of the pie, so that other people who didn't get pie. You still get pie. Eat your pie and be quiet, right? So, needless to say, I don't care about tone, right? And indeed, that doesn't always go well, and I can say what I want with the mic in front of folk and, you know, the person with the power and the red pen and the power to grade and all of that good stuff, right? But I go there because I don't think it comes down to how you say it that's gonna make people okay with getting less pie, right? And some would say, you know, well, we just bake more pie for everyone. But when you're talking about the classroom, the semester is only so long. And if you're gonna widen the cannon, you have to take things out. That's the only way it works, right? So you get a smaller piece of pie, but nobody's taking your pie. You still eat pie.
Okay, just going off of that question, but in a different direction.
I'm gonna get in trouble.
No, in a different direction, do you have advice for students who want to, quote unquote, share the pie? So like, because I feel like we often hear kind of questions similar to that, and I feel like I don't often hear a lot about how I can make a difference as a student for marginalized voices.
I think you just, okay, so it's gonna sound weird to say just do it. And I think that there are as many manifestations of that there are people that want to do that, right? And it looks different on everybody, right? And calls for different techniques in different spaces, right? But I think the desire to do it is a good start. And then you do it, right? Then you don't talk as much and you let other voices speak. And you read other works, right? And you recognize that there are other voices out there and you go seek them, right? And I think that's a way to start.
Hi, I was just curious, like having an English major background and working in religion, do you find yourself like bringing techniques of close reading or anything that you learned through literature to looking at like religious texts and your own faith?
Yep, absolutely. So when I entered seminary and I realized that a lot of students had issues with intro to Old Testament or intro to New Testament, it was a different way for reading the Bible for them, because what it was literary criticism and close reading. And I was like, oh, I got this, right? Like how to read a text? right? Been trained. And that is a major part of what I do, right? I read and critique text, and I read and critique context. And I think that's the basic training of the English major, right? So while, some may say, well, you're not really doing anything with the degree, I'm doing everything with the degree, right? Because what it taught me how to do was read and critique, and that's what I do.
Sorry, I'm being a bad teacher here and asking a second question. On the topic of critiquing text and context, you mentioned your book, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that project. And then specifically, I'm sure it's also a stressful process in many ways, of course. What do you find most inspiring and most frustrating working on this project at this moment?
So I feel like I've been working on this project my whole life. Okay. So let me first tell you about the book. It is called, currently, Nurturing the Sanctified Imagination of Urban Youth. It is a spinoff of my dissertation that focused on ministry to Black girls from poor working class backgrounds. Frustration number one, the book you want to write isn't always the book they want to publish, right? So there's been a switch in focus. And sometimes it's hard to keep that motivation and fire up for something that isn't quite what you want to do, right? Frustration number two, I've been working on this for a really long time. And it's kind of hard to keep the motivation up for I am so over this topic. But on most days when I pick it up, it keeps me going because I think it's something that needs to be heard. And when I present and talk about it, it sounds like something that people find interesting. And it's important for me to have the dialogue with other people because when you study something for so long, it's hard to think of that your ideas are that profound and deep and special, right? So I write and I go, who doesn't notice? Everybody knows this, right? I don't even know I'm writing this on paper. And then someone says, that's a really good idea. And I go, okay. So maybe I'm not the best judge of that, right? Which leads to part of my way of writing, which is that I write in community, right? This makes sense to me. Does this make sense to you? I have folks who read all of my work, a mentor of mine who is also a Christian educator, and my husband who's a physicist, who knows way more about the womanist theology than any physicist needs to know, right? But this is not his field. So I'm if it can make sense to someone this is your field, and someone who knows nothing about this, then we might have something going here. And I often don't think that we are the best judge of our work, and sometimes need to get out of our own head. It's also, working with an editor is also like working with all those peers that you send your stuff out to, and then they send you stuff back, and you're convinced that they're idiots, right? I know that's not what happens here. You go, oh, this is so great. This makes my work so much better. Right? It's that process over and over again with someone who has the power at times to make you change things. So I know many writers that for them it is a struggle. I know some writers who are ashamed is strong, but who hesitate to promote their own work because it really isn't theirs. And I decided from that I'd rather go unpublished than put my name on something that wasn't mine. But the Academy also requires publications and names on things, and people want to get tenure and raises and promotions, and so you figure out how to walk that line and stay true to who you are.
Thank you. And I just have one question here from the live stream.
Ooh.
Thank you, Shelby.
Ooh, ah.
This is from Haley Cohen, and she is at Princeton Seminary alum living in Durham, England right now. And this is her, quote, "I was wondering if you could say more about your journey from growing up Catholic to now being an ordained woman."
Okay, yeah. Hey, Amy. So when I was a little girl, I thought I was going to be a nun. My husband's happy that I didn't go that route. But my mom still thinks that, like, if she had spoken to the right people, I would have been a nun, right? But for me, when I look back, I think about that as feeling a call to ministry. And as a woman in a Catholic church, that was the only option, right? And like the nuns were just really cool. And I still think that. I'm not joking. They were really awesome women. So I thought, yeah, I could do that. It's so odd because my walk away from Catholicism wasn't very deep or profound, or I have issues with the church or any of that. I grew up charismatic Catholic. I moved to the States, and that's not a thing, right? So I went to Mass, and I didn't know what they were doing, right? I was like, where are your drums? Where are your steel pans? Where are your, like what is this organ thing you got going on here? So, which is another experience for me to how I know that context is key, right? And what I was looking for was a congregation that kind of spoke to me in a worship style that, felt somewhat familiar, right? And that happened to be a non-denominational congregation. And then when I went to seminary, it was as this Protestant non-denominational person. And I had this conversation with this pastor after one of my theology classes about communion, because the understanding of communion is very different in Protestantism than it is in Roman Catholicism. And then he said, to commune, do you believe that this needs to happen? And I said, yes. And he said, well, then, Annie, you haven't communed in 5 years, right? It was so gradual for me that it wasn't like I'm walking away, right? Like, that's not what I was doing. I just kind of found myself growing and moving in these particular ways, which, as you can tell, is kind of like my story, right? I just kind of grow and move and find myself in different places. When I went to seminary, it wasn't even actually to be a minister. I wasn't even going for the Master of Divinity at the time. I was going for a 2-year master's to figure out how to help better teach my youth, right? I was not interested in being ordained. I would have gone to a secular program if they had what I needed. I looked. When my pastor said seminary, I was like, ain't that for holy people? So it was a very gradual move. And it was there that I felt a call to be an ordained person. And I can't really describe it more than saying I felt a call to be an ordained person. I was in this process in a non-denominational church. I'm going to make it story shorter. In the middle of the process, he decided that he no longer believed in ordaining women. And while, yes, I had issue with that conclusion, I had a bigger issue with the fact that one human being, could make that decision. And everybody can go along with it. So I said, okay, so I need a denomination. And I did some denominational hopping and searching and landed United Methodists, who this week have their own issues going on. But that's kind of how I came here. I do not regret or talk down any of my faith traditions. They're all a part of what has formed me. And I see them as all a part of a rich, diverse understanding of what church is. And it helps me help my students when they come from a particular context and they say church, and it's the building they've been in for the past 20 years, right? And my experience in a variety of faith traditions helps me to see how diverse and messy and complicated and beautiful the church is.
Maybe take one or two more.
Hello, my name is Christian, and I'm a first year. My question is, since you wanted to transfer at first, but then you thought about study abroad, and you said it was very much worth it, can you speak to why that was and whether that has influenced what you do now?
I could talk about Cameroon all day. So that's where I studied abroad. It was amazing. Gosh, how does it influence what I do now? It really helped me just to see how big the world was, right? Again, how big, beautiful, and complex it is. And I go back to a lot of the conversations that I had there, right? Conversations that I didn't even know were conversations. So speaking to some university student, and at one point he said, well, you know, we have to even, I think I was taking a Africa before colonization class, right? And then he said, well, we have to talk about the fact that we're having this conversation in English. And I was like, English is the language I speak. I don't understand what you're talking about, right? But, you know, I think that for many West Indians and some Black Americans, there's this view of Africa as this pure cultural place and not understanding the legacy of colonization and what it has done to this space. And that's what he meant by we have to have a conversation about what it means to have this conversation in English, right? One of the first radio things we heard, right, when we were just setting up our new apartment there was about, there were two, there was one about how to have positive views of Africa in the West, which I thought was interesting. And the other was about how to claim a true African identity. And I was like, okay, so if you can't claim a true African identity, like I'm standing in Africa, like it was just blowing my mind, right? So it really helped me see how big the world is, how big the questions are, right? And again, it all comes back to me, to context, right? And how context is queen. Context shapes everything. But yes, you can meet me at the reception. I could talk to you about Cameroon all day. That place is beautiful.
I think I'm going to take that as a transition to remind everyone that at 6:30, so in about 3/4 of an hour, we'll be gathering over in the Hub Social Hall for a reception to continue celebrating and communing with our speaker, with Reverend Annie. And but before we do that, I just want to say, as a member of the English department and your faculty member, write your own syllabus, wonderful, and you know, use the workshop, benefit from the wisdom that it brings in whatever form that takes. And raspberry, strawberry, lemon, lime, blueberry, apple, cherry, pumpkin, plum. I'm not sure how much pie is going to be at the literary dessert contest, but there is going to be dessert, and there's going to be community. And let's just thank Reverend Annie Lockhart-Gilroy for an incredible talk and conversation.